I believe firmly that whether or not you believe a ghost is real, a ghost story is real. And then my question is, where did this ghost story come from? It is almost always based in some real thing that happened. I like to say ghosts are arrows to history. They ask us to look a little bit more deeply into the history of a place or of a person or of like local folklore. I love ghosts. I don't find them scary. I find them like any people. Some are mean and some want things that you can't give them. But usually a ghost is asking you to think about your relationship to space or to yourself or to it. And we're haunted by something that we can't see or we can't put our finger on it, but we know it's there. We experience it every day. And I think this is why a lot of people, they are often really nervous to tell you a ghost story because they feel a little bit crazy. And I don't mean that dismissively, but they sort of feel like logically, this ghost can't be real. But I am experiencing something in my life that I can't put my finger on, but it just feels real weird. And it feels real weird every Sunday at 4:00. There's a pattern to it or whatever it is. And so people are trying to make sense of that. And I think we don't live in a culture where your answer to trying to make sense of something is a ghost, and so people, when they've come to that conclusion, they feel uncomfortable. Academia just tries to interpret the world. I sort of bristle at the notion of an academic expert. I think that anyone can be an expert once you start paying attention to like the history, the pattern, the possibilities, like what have other people said about this? And so I do think sometimes people are like, oh, you study ghosts? I'm like, that's a whole field of study, but it's actually usually the study of history. And ghost stories are historical stories, or they're the study of human psychology, or it's a sociological study. You're really curious, like, how do you feel about death? Ghost story will tell you a lot about how a person feels about death. But if you ask someone, how do you feel about death? You're going to get a very different answer than, do you believe in ghosts, or have you ever experienced a ghost? Again, for me, I'm a historian and I study violence and I study sort of like performances of violence. And that's where I got interested in ghosts in the very beginning, is just like, how does a ghost remind us not to forget a particularly violent history? I have collected hundreds of stories, and they almost always fall into the same basic categories. One of the categories of ghost is the ghost that just wants company. Like, ghost wants to hang out with me. That's really, really common. Like, they're not hostile ghosts. They just want to hang out with people. I have found that the kind of ghost that everybody hates is the hostile ghost, right? The ghost that is like, get out, you should not be here. People most often experience that as a feeling, not something they've seen. And I find that those kinds of ghosts you hear about most often in contested spaces. So it is this sort of classic, this is built on a native burial ground. Also, I noticed in Chicago collecting ghost stories, lots and lots of those in gentrifying neighborhoods. I'll give an example of like one time we were doing a story workshop in Humboldt Park. And one of the people who was in the workshop with us was a longtime resident. Her family had owned the home before, African-American woman, an elder. She was like, yeah, I got a ghost, and she described the ghost so lovingly. She loved the ghost. And then there was a newer resident who was a white woman. She spent the whole time talking about how she had worked so hard to get rid of that ghost, like who she thought the ghost was, telling it it's not welcome here, it has to leave, by like the ghost gentrifier, where she's like, this is my house now and you got to get out. Then I started noticing that anxiety over and over again in spaces where people, I think, are not quite sure if they have a right to be in the space. And so then their relationship with previous residents, dead ones, but also maybe living ones who have been exiled, becomes more complicated than if you're like, yeah, I'm supposed to be here and you can be here too. It's cool. The one that is most interesting to me in my research are the ghosts where they're really reminders that something horrible has happened. So that these are the people who have been murdered, the people who had a really unjust thing happen. They were left out in the cold. They were locked into a building and there was a fire. Lots of those in Chicago, right? We're famous for it. And that those, I think, are the ghosts who are demanding justice. And they don't want us to forget what happened to them, because what happened to them hasn't been resolved. Like, they never got justice in their lifetime, and they want us to remember it. Or if you don't believe in a ghost, what the story is asking us to do is not forget that that happened, which is equally important, I don't know if there's a way to think about proving a ghost story is real, but I think that there are patterns that you hear so often that they seem like, that tracks. I have heard very few stories where somebody claims to see a ghost, like Ghostbusters, and these ghosts are just like floating around, fully embodied. I've heard very few of those. Every now and then, somebody is like, I see a part of a person. I see a shadow of a person. I see something out of the corner of my eye. That happens. So if somebody is seeing a whole ghost, I'm like, that's a very rare sighting. More often, it is a feeling. You'll hear people saying over and over again, like haven't even talked to each other, and they'll sync up the bad feeling that's in a room. We've heard the same report in the same room from generations of people. We work a lot with youth, so we sort of have a new population every 3 or 4 years. And they'll always be like, can you come with me into this room? Because, oh no, I don't like it. I'm like, oh my God, nobody likes that room because that's where the ghost is hanging out. But it's almost always a feeling. And that's what I believe more is the people who are like, I can't explain it. It just feels strange, or I feel like my grandmother is here. It's fundamentally irrational because feelings are irrational. But that doesn't make them unreal.
Next week in Lakeview, a rabbi steps up to the plate.
Is God a Cubs fan?
From Superphonic Studios, this is Chicago. Listen every Sunday.